Hello again. We've become so indoctrinated these days into feeling guilty about slavery, imperialism, colonialism, and the dreadful things which white people did to the indigenous inhabitants of Africa, Australia, and the Americas that it might seem a little shocking to ask if the coming of the Europeans was, after all, such a bad thing for those already living in the territories which were colonised. After all, the standard narrative these days is that the arrival of white people in these new areas was a prelude to genocide and slavery. Here's what a modern book for the average lay reader has to say about the Spanish conquistadors landing in Mexico. This is a Reader's Digest popular book about the age of exploration, but it's quite interesting because it gives the generally accepted view now. It is correct. And we see here on page 48, Land of the Conquistadors. Hungry for fame and wealth, Spanish soldiers of fortune arrived in South America. Their onslaughts destroyed ancient civilizations as they built an empire larger and richer than any since the days of Rome. Their onslaughts destroyed ancient civilizations. Well, let's look at one of those ancient civilizations. The Aztecs ruled part of what is now Mexico, and the conquest of their territory by Spanish adventurers led by Cortes is often cited as a terrible act akin to genocide. So let's think a little about this ancient civilization. The Aztec culture, although it had inherited bits and pieces from earlier groups in Central America, had only been going for a century or so when the Spanish arrived, so it wasn't really that ancient. It is also debatable the extent to which it could really even be called a civilization. They had not managed to invent either the door or the wheel. Their houses didn't have doors, and nor did they have a written language. The closest the Aztecs came were pictograms which acted as mnemonic aids. To be called writing, a system must be able to express any idea which can be thought of or spoken about, and by that definition the Aztec glyphs fell woefully short of being able to be defined as a true written language. The Aztecs followed a death cult because they believed that the sun was dying and at constant risk of going out entirely, unless it was fed regularly with human blood. The entire culture was therefore bound up in murder on an industrial scale. This was conducted against other ethnic groups such as the Mayans, some of whom were exterminated, and so we can quite accurately say that genocide was present in Central America before the coming of white people. The method of murder was simple and brutal. The victims were dragged to the top of a pyramid and their chests were chiselled open and the still beating heart removed, and then the corpse was just flung down the steps. It was in this way that the Aztecs believed that the sun could be maintained, that it was a bit like a central heating system, only it ran on fresh blood rather than gas or oil. It is impossible to say accurately how many such murders were committed each year in the Aztec Empire. Estimates range from a minimum of 20,000 to as many as 250,000 every year. Excavations in Mexico City have uncovered a tower of skulls, which was built of thousands of skulls of the victims of the massacres carried out by the Aztecs as part of their religion. In the description to this video, I give a link to a news item about this discovery. All this puts into context the claims that the Spanish were murderous marauders. Their expeditions to Central America in the early 1520s were certainly not Sunday school outings, and they killed people whenever they felt like it or thought it useful. The numbers, though, were trifling compared to what was already being inflicted on those living in what is now Mexico. At that time, the Aztecs were constantly raiding villages on the fringes of their own territory for prisoners, who could be either enslaved or sacrificed. The Spanish were aided in the conquest by Mayans who had long suffered under the Aztecs and Cortes only had 500 men with him. It was the Mayans who helped him to overthrow the Aztecs, whom they feared and loathed. Once the Spanish took control of the area, the bloodletting came to a sudden end, for which everybody was very grateful. It is true that the Spanish occupiers killed people sometimes, and that the Inquisition was active in Mexico and executed some people for heresy. But these numbers were trifling compared to what had been going on before the country was colonised. Certainly tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were not being murdered routinely every year after the Spanish took over. The truth is that for Mexico, colonialism was a blessing which saved the lives of perhaps millions of people in the long run. This is just a single example of the way in which white exploration and conquest has been distorted in recent years and claimed to be an unmitigated disaster for the natives. It was not. Almost invariably, fewer people were killed after the white people took over new territories than before. And although it's quite true that some people were enslaved, this has always been the case before the Europeans came. Slavery, like ethnic murder, has been a universal feature of life throughout human history, and it's certainly not just associated with Europeans.